In this video, we'll take a look at tables, text, and picture displays. So to start, let's look at an average sensitivity value on a table. Tables are the most flexible display type because they can show curves, values, and results. This specific value doesn't contain an x value, but if it did, then it would also be displayed. If we want to change the configuration of a table, we can set that in Display, Preferences. At the top, we can change the title. So I'll switch it from the generic title that it starts with to Sensitivities. Now when I click OK, we can see the new title. Before we look at some of the other options, I'm just going to add some more values. As I drop them in, you can see they get added to new columns. Just by adding more and more items to the same table, it can sometimes get a little crowded. So when we go back to Preferences, we can see some tools we have to deal with this. The first option is the column width. By default, it will auto-size. This best fits the column to the data that's being displayed on the table. The Y columns need to fit the name and has a longer unit title, so it takes up more space. Instead, we could switch to have a fixed width. Instead of different sizes depending on the length of the name or data, we can just specify how wide each is. Instead of specifying, we can enable manual resize. I can just grab and move around the columns to their desired width. This is a little bit more labor intensive initially because you have to go through and change the width of all of your columns, but it allows for much greater control over the display. Now back in Preferences, let's look at the table format options. The checkbox to transpose will switch the layout between columns and rows. Underneath this, if the column option is a fixed width, then we can specify the row header width. Instead of changing the width of all of the columns that contain all of the data, or all of the rows that contain all of the data, then this will just change the width of the headers. I'll set it back to auto, and we can see what happens when we disable some items from the table. I'll uncheck units and grid lines. Now this looks less like a spreadsheet display and a little bit more like a text-based display. I'm now going to add THD and THD normalized to the table, and we'll look at what changing the number format does. The first option switches between SI and floating point. With the smaller numbers, this will change from using only decimals to now having an M for milli. The number below is how many significant digits the table will display. We can also switch to digits of precision. You'll notice that everything switched to having 5 places except for the Z data for sensitivity at 10 kHz. The reason for this is we have hide trailing zeros enabled. If I disable this, we can see the full 5 digits. Notice the numbers are a little different between different precisions and formats. The combination of the two is what's going to change your final result. The section on the right allows us to change the font and background configuration. The first option will allow us to select different font for the text. Anything that we select from the dropdown will apply to the table. We can also set the size. So I'll adjust the table to make sure all of our data is now visible. Back in Preferences, I can set the color of the font and the color of the background. On the far right, these checkboxes will let us bold, italicize, underline, or strike through the text. Selecting plain will remove all enabled options. These settings are all table specific. If I open up a new table, none of what I changed will carry through. If I want to save these settings, remember you can use the display menu in the memory list to duplicate the current display with all of its settings, or set it as a default so every time you open a new table, it will have this configuration. Next, we'll look at text displays. These are very similar to tables in their configuration, but differs in what they display. Text windows don't actually display anything from the memory list. They just display messages to the operator that are typed into the window. These are really useful to help put instructions, give context to a measurement, or to describe a test that's currently running. When we look under the display options, we can bold, italicize, or underline. Then in Format Text, we see the exact same controls as the Fonts section in the table menu. We can change around the colors, switch the font to something different, or make the text bigger or smaller. So I'll configure this in a way that I think will capture the attention of an operator. Then I'll change my text window to make sure it's legible. Pictures are displays that will just show an image from the disk in a display step. They can either be JPEGs or bitmap. You could display how a device should be wired before you run a test, a setup of where the reference microphone should be placed in the room, or anything else that could help visually show the operator what to be doing. If we go to Preferences, we can set a title and then point to the file. So for my test, I want a picture of my dog to show up on my display steps, so I just point to that file on disk. Now there's two different options. I can resize the window to the picture, or resize the picture to my window. If I resize the window to the picture, my display is going to change to whatever the size of my picture is on disk. If I select Resize Picture to Window, then my picture will attempt to best fit the size of the window that I already created. This file is pretty large, so I'll select Resize to Window. Once the display window is there, I can change the size and place it where I want. In the next video, we'll look at result displays.